And we are back with another exciting Giantart Reviews of a film that was requested of me. And again, if you want me to review a film, within reason, of course, it has to be an actual film. Or even a piece of text. I have an article, a Substack someone wanted me to review. Or anything, well, yeah, a film or a text. You know my usual fee, $100 US. And my PayPal link is all in the bio. But anyways, apart from that formality, I have a number of exciting reviews to do, and everyone liked the Legally Blonde review. But here I was requested to review the 1970s avant-garde animation film from France called Fantastic Planet. Now, Fantastic Planet, for those who don't know, is truly, I think, one of the most brilliant feats in science fiction. Even though the politics, albeit novel at the time, you could consider, well, it's kind of like left liberal propaganda or whatever. But apart from that, I will get into the politics. But I truly wanted to give an in-depth review of Fantastic Planet, from the actual aesthetic and art style to a lot of the different themes that go outside of the traditional norm of what is considered science fiction. So for this podcast, I'm not going to do like a video essay style breakdown on here's this weird film. Like I'm not going to do like all these like film reviewers or these bread tuba left millennial left code video essayists where they do this like very flashy type of thing where they're like, here's the significance and impact of the best animation film ever, or here's the scariest. When they were doing Come and See, where like the scariest film ever made isn't even a horror film, and of course it's Come and See is a great film, but unfortunately it's been taken up into the Reddit hive mind and it sort of has sullied it. But anyways, not that artwork can truly be sullied, but I don't want to. I'm assuming that most people have seen this. If you haven't, I highly recommend seeing it. So there will be spoiler alerts, and the way I approach it is more of a dive into the common themes rather than getting the genealogy and the progression of the film 100% correct. Because I'm a podcaster, right? I'm a Theory Cell podcaster. For those who are searching Fantastic Planet that aren't familiar with my work, I wanted to go into some of the deeper themes, and then eventually I will get to the politics or the context of why the film was made. Or I might just get that out of the way, but no, probably not. I'll probably save that for the end. And again, if you want to support my work on a more regular basis, go to patreon.com/GiantArtProductions. You can find my Twitter, my Instagram, for my artwork. And I will eventually have my site released to the public where you can buy my artwork and my various prints. It's just I have to have time because I'm editing my book on art criticism and politics, which I've been promoting for a year now, because it took me all of last year to write it, and hopefully you enjoy it. But if you want to support my work on that basis, and if you do want to request a film or another piece of media for me to review, even a piece of artwork, well, I mean, artwork's kind of difficult because if you wanted me to review the work of an artist or something like that, well, that can be arranged. Anyways, Fantastic Planet, just to get the basic information out of the way first, was made in, I believe, 1975. Yes, 1973. And it's weird because at the time it was, of course, directed in France. It was created in France by René Leroux and by Ronald Topor. But it was animated in Prague by Jiří Trnka. And he was truly a visionary animator that did a lot of other things. But just to quickly comment on the animation style, I quite liked how it had a surreal feel to it in the sort of very heavily ink and watercolor style. Most of it was handmade. It took an incredible amount of work and effort to actually animate it. And the actual film has a lot of very surreal and a lot of very psychedelic even elements, and a lot of anthropomorphization of the landscape that you'd find in a lot of the works of, at that time, contemporary surrealism, or especially in Europe with fantastical realism, not to the same extent of detail, orientation, or even mythos, although I will say that I will eventually get to the heavily mythological elements in the film, or rather the film creates its own mythos. But the art style has a lot of anthropomorphization of the landscape and only has a few bits of technology, like the meeting of the giant teleprompter in the civilization of the Togs. Is that how you pronounce it? I'm getting the Trogs. That's how you pronounce it. I'm getting lost. There's the Ohms and the Trogs. Of course, it's very interesting how at this time they would use the choice of the word or Ohm to describe humans or the humanoids that are the sort of primitive tribal tiny people that inhabit the landscape of the fantastic planet. And we'll get to eventually that they're actually humans that have come from the post-apocalyptic civilization after destroying planet Earth. Then they end up on the planet of the Trog. But it's interesting how the art style is in keeping with a different approach to science fiction, and I guess you would call it quote-unquote soft science fiction, which is a distinction I really hate, by the way. I really think that it's sort of like the sciencey nerd, people that read like authors like Asimov, and it's all these people that have this I effing love science, or I effing love scientism attitude, where any sort of science fiction or what is slotted as science fiction genre, because it has a lot of futuristic elements, but then deal with a lot of relations between civilizations or human psychology, or even stories that don't exactly fit the fantasy genre. Ursula K. Le Guin is a good example of this. And they're like, well, that's not like real science fiction. That's not like nerd science fiction where they have different technologies and they go in space, man. And because it is, there is a lot of space and there is a lot of technological elements to Fantastic Planet. But what's really interesting is that there is technology, there is space travel, there is rival civilizations, but there's a lot of emphasis on innate abilities that come about either from evolution or from spiritual evolution. So here are the key themes, and we're over 7 minutes, 8 minutes in actually. Here are the key themes that I think I should list off really quickly before I get into that thought and before I get into the art style that complements a very surrealistic and anthropomorphized landscape of the surreal. So there is an obvious emphasis on spiritual evolution. There is an obvious emphasis on technology, at least to some extent, that is co-committed with the development of consciousness. And of course, spiritual practices and meditation. Along with the political themes of course, class divide, a lot of G-word idol, starts with an E, ends with Genix, if you know what I mean, type of content. A lot of it comes from the backdrop of the massive shifts in civilization that was occurring in Europe and North America, especially in France, because at this time, this is in the early 70s in France, of course, the New Age movement had hit. There was a lot of, there was always a fascination in France with sinology, and there was always a fascination with the Far East, and there was a lot of sinologists that would go to France or were fluent in France, in both French and in Cantonese and in Japanese and so forth. I'm thinking of Francois Julian as a good example of someone who has very acquainted with Western philosophy, but also with a lot of the philosophies of the East. And so there was a huge emphasis on that in France. And of course, this was at the time of immense political turmoil in France's post-colonial phase, or rather, France losing its colonies, particularly in Algeria. And there was a lot of the political content. Of course, the post 68 France with the student upheavals and with the new left really taking hold, there was a lot of this consciousness of political radicalism meeting a new form of an opening of France or multiculturalism, meeting a sort of New Ageism. But what's very interesting is that New Ageism in Fantastic Planet, that awareness and that growth of consciousness, is actually another form of spiritual bondage, or rather another form of political control that is the inhabitants of this planet, the Trogs, exercise their supreme godlike ability against a lesser being, which is, of course, humanity. And of course, and so to get it out of the way, of course, there's the sort of liberal humanist, clever sort of juxtaposition of what contemporary French society was going through, particularly in the backdrop of losing the Algerian War, losing Vietnam, and so forth, losing their colonies, and a new way of life. And it's sort of like the inversion, or rather the clever reversal, where it's, oh, what if the humans actually were enslaved by a higher race of beings? And so again, you see a lot of this. I mean, that's a very surface level. The politics are, of course, incredibly important, but I think that the deeper themes in some ways eclipse the sort of bog standard liberalism and sort of progressive humanism of the film. And even the soundtrack is incredibly jazz and psychedelic rock orientated. It's kind of very strange because at that time it was slated as like, this is the sound of the future. Of course, nowadays we see that, oh, it's kind of dated. If this was made nowadays, there would be a lot more electronic music. There would be, there would be a lot more like, future sound. And there was a lot, and especially in France, with musique concrète, and then even certain genres of punk. I'm thinking of the band Chrome. There was a lot of emphasis and a lot of like exploration on the avant-garde edges of music. And I think the soundtrack actually did quite a good job. But the art style being very hand-drawn, a lot of pen and wash color, a lot of very fascinating animation choices in terms of just the space and the depth of the landscape, complemented the whole film of Fantastic Planet. And how the little people of the humanoids, the Oms, inhabit tiny spaces in either the abandoned park or the abandoned rocket plant. But also one really amazing feat of animation was one scene where the main character, who is an Om that is captured as the plaything and the pet of the daughter of the family that's highlighted. The main character's name is Terre, right? And his master is the Trog child, the daughter of Master Sinha, the key Trog leader, is Taiwa. So Terre is Terre is the main character that then becomes a Promethean figure within the civilization of the Oms. And so there again, you have the themes of post-colonialism, or rather the sort of relationship between a lot of the higher classes in France, a lot of the bourgeois and the higher classes who were able to, especially in the colonies in Algeria and in Vietnam, able to have servants of the various peoples, the various native populations, indigenous populations. And then, of course, you have the children that play with them, that have nannies, that have various helpers. And you see a lot of this in the media at the time, the popular films at the time as well. And that relationship is tested because, of course, you are part of an aristocratic bloodline, and it's like you're fraternizing with these type of people, and that becomes a sticking point because then there's a sort of casual agreement that happens at the very end when Sinha, he sees the example of Taiwa and how she is so enthralled by this Trog. Sorry, she's so enthralled by this child. But yet he's still at the level of a pet after his mother was redacted by other children of the Trog. And then he's sort of captured and made a pet. And he's sort of like displaced. And this is, again, another theme of colonial display. Well, I'll get to that. But the art style is very interesting because a lot of the animal life, or the sort of flora and fauna of Fantastic Planet, also becomes important in terms of various functions. So, for example, these slime monsters give the clothing, very primitive hunter-gatherer type of loincloth and shawl cloth clothing. One of the brilliant feats of animation was when a group of the Trogs are meditating. Because, of course, a lot of relations and a lot of the powers of the Trog come from a state of not technological advancement, but rather the advancement of consciousness, the advancement of intelligence. And in their meditative states, it is discovered that they facilitate exoplanetary politics on this island adjacent, on the sun or planet island, this barren planet with statues that they inhabit adjacent to the Fantastic Planet, to the planet of the Trog. And there's this one scene where a group of them in the house of Sinha, they're meditating to change form. They're changing their bodily compositions along with the change of their consciousness. Of course, their sight leaves their body. It inhabits these orbs that then go to an off-planet site. And it's a very strange sequence of capillary and blood work and different suits that then mesh into each other. They're achieving a form, or rather a physical manifestation of a meditative state where their consciousness is fused together as their bodies fuse together. They change the various patterns of clothing. Then their pattern of their of the bodies themselves change in the state of meditation. And of course, the session of meditation is disrupted by Taiwa and Terra, because Terra gets loose. He's always trying to escape, but then he's given a collar in which Taiwa can call him back, and of course he breaks free when he discovers the wilded Alms in the forest, which is an abandoned park. And of course, the Alms are selectively called every few time cycles, to keep their population under control. Again, another theme of colonialism, and another theme of the certain events in the 20th century. For example, I can't say exactly, but there's a scene where they're controlling the population, where they have in gas masks the sort of helper Alms, the house Alms, guiding the Trogs, and they have these automatic machines, and then of course there's automatic hover robots that go and find Trogs to call their population when they've escaped the park and they go to the hinterlands of the abandoned rocket facility. That releases these gas pellets. Well, yeah, let's not say too much, but put it this way: there's a lot of allusions to apartheid, a certain event in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, that France was the regime that captured France at that time. You know what I mean. Anyways, there's a lot of allusions, of course, to the colonialism that France conducted in Algeria, and this was post-Algerian War from the early 60s, where there was a lot of reports of French soldiers using, let's call them, what's the politically correct term I could use on YouTube that the Bush administration used? Enhanced interrogation methods, including of an actual variety against female prisoners, and the encampment and the sort of imprisonment of whole populations. I believe Giorgio Agamben talks about this in his book Homo Sacer, that Algeria became a state of exception, and essentially the Alms, the humanoids, the tiny humanoids compared to the Trogs, are in a perpetual state of exception. They are abandoned to the law. They are either pets, or they are a population in need of being controlled. Their numbers are artificially depleted, to use a politically correct term, every so often, periodically. Of course, they are subject to both the machinations of disciplinary time and punishment and the culling of their populations. And they are subject to a sort of less than state of bare life, to the point where they have primitivized themselves. Because it's discovered at the end of Fantastic Planet that they actually are humans that have destroyed planet Earth. They have managed to escape. They've managed to achieve an off-planet existence. They discover the Trogs, and then they become, through, it's sort of an ironic reversal where we blow up the planet through aggression and racism and apartheid and othering, and of course now we are subject to a state of lowly savagery as a result on another planet by clearly superior beings. But then, of course, there is a slave revolt, and there is a Promethean figure that delivers the awareness of knowledge and the technological capacity towards knowledge in the figure of Terre. So I will get to that as well. But so the animation style is quite brilliant. It's quite a lot of the anthropomorphic landscape of various plants and various elements within the world of the Trog is quite interesting, and it really grates with the norm of sci-fi in that you don't have a technological landscape as much of a conscious landscape. That a lot of the Trogs can interact with their landscapes. A lot of the animals have a form of intelligence as well. Very strange, surreal antipods that inhabit this vast, sprawling landscape. A lot of the tree life looks very unique. The Oms have to fight off certain predator birds and certain other warring tribes that then have to unite to revolt against the Trogs. And of course, they end up redacting a Trog after the event of the population control. And it becomes a sort of panic because now you have a lesser being revolting and redacting a superior one. And of course, that's to highlight the relationship between colonialism and so forth, and particularly slave revolts or post-colonial movements that were happening in Africa, Asia, Latin America at the time. And of course, it's to relate the relationship between the dominant European aristocrat, the colonialist, and his colonial subject that then rebels. That's the basic political message of Fantastic Planet. But what's very interesting is this relationship between consciousness, meditation, higher states of being, not just as a form of spiritual enlightenment, but as a form of control. So the Trogs are obsessed with meditation. They're obsessed with their spiritual consciousness and their spiritual health and well-being, yet they exert a sort of Nietzschean overman type of relationship to lesser life forms, which is a very, very interesting juxtaposition coming at the tail, because 1973, you could say, was the maturation of the New Age movement in the West, but at the same time, the tail end of it, before it became like total grifting guru, erotic cult exploitation that you have in the 1980s. But this was the maturation of the New Age movement. No longer are the flower children these idealistic, fun-loving hippies. Of course, there was a lot of dark side to the hippies as well that often gets overlooked, but for various political reasons, because the boomers that inhabit institutions don't exactly like to talk about that. They don't like to talk about that, but there was a sort of maturation, but at the same time a waning of the New Age movement. But now you have this relation between meditative practices, higher consciousness, space exploration, there are facets of technology such as the school necklace that Taiwa wears, and all children wear to be educated. I believe even Star Trek had that theme, if I recall. I know that the later movies where it highlights Spock when he was a child, the Vulcan has a similar sort of educational pod that you go into and the lessons implant into your consciousness by some strange crossing of the wires in the control necklace, that the communication and control necklace that Tara is fitted with. He can also experience the same lessons as Taiwa, and he's this Promethean figure that gains the knowledge of the Trogs and their civilization, and he knows the basic mapping of the planet's geography, the different seasonal zones, but he also knows how their history and genealogy came about, and how their civilization developed from a great sage that came before them, who's rumored to still be spiritually with them in his tomb, guiding in sort of like a how shall I say it, like a Hollow Earth theme, or a spiritualized crypt or grave that still guides a civilization on a planetary scale. And he learns the lessons of how their civilization arose. And so then when he escapes, he brings the necklace with him, and he gives this knowledge to a reluctant civilization. So Taiwa, is learning the same as her pet, and this is how the slave revolt happens. Very similar to a lot of post-colonial administrators in various countries in Africa and in Latin America and Asia. For example, Frantz Fanon was educated by Jean-Paul Sartre in France, and a lot of them were Marxist leaders. A lot of the leaders of post-colonial movements had Western educations, were educated by various Marxists from Russia and China, and so forth. And so you have this direct parallel where these Western bourgeois who received a Western bourgeois education, especially in philosophy, that they then become these Promethean post-colonial figures that then go back to their homelands and educate the native populations, that then stage these post-colonial revolts. And there's a lot of political concerns as well when it comes to the actual history of it. There's a lot of meddling from various intelligence agencies and so forth. But anyways, that's besides the point. To stick to the movie, what's very interesting is sort of something that is present in a weird way, a lot of ancient societies, which is something that defies, although the message of the film instantiates and supports our sort of like linear view of history and progress and liberal values. But what's present in the Trog society is something that was in the ancient world, which is how come you can have an aristocratic collectivist society that is centered around spiritual enlightenment, that is centered around the values of meditation and of exoplanetary consciousness, but one that is very callous to egalitarianism and equality and so forth. And that the values of reaching a higher spiritual dimension sort of clouds your judgment in terms of the very lowest of your civilization. But in some weird ways, the humanoid Oms are kind of like an invasive species. They are people that have come not by the conscious choice of the Trogs. So that is a complication if you're going at it from a purely amoral, objective take. But they're, in a weird way, reinscribed into a different dominance hierarchy because they themselves have destroyed planet Earth and have managed to, at one point, achieve the lifting off of their civilization that they've left behind, that they've abandoned, that they've destroyed, and now have found themselves back to a primitive, back to a state of nature. A state of nature, of course, that is colored by their relationship to a higher life form, or rather a form that has been more developed on that grand scale of planetary and exoplanetary consciousness. So they end up becoming very superstitious of technology, very superstitious of knowledge itself and of the power of the Trogs. But then when they're given that Promethean gift by Terre, they then discover that they have to once again build rockets and spaceships to find a new planet. And they eventually, at the very end, spoiler alert, they at the end, when they destroy the statues of the Trogs, and so threaten their quest of maximum spiritual enlightenment, that prevents them from gaining. And I know this is not necessarily something that because I have a greater view of history or whatever, but, I guess in keeping with the theme of the film, the meaning of it, that their quest for spiritual enlightenment pollutes them from a very humanistic element of higher consciousness. Now, that's debatable, of course, because there is an element of will to power to the Trogs that have then become wrapped into a sort of bourgeois unawareness of the lower and more primitive creatures in their planet, that they then create all sorts of kind of population control methods against, that they keep as pets. But then when they have demonstrated to them that they are capable of synthesizing the knowledge of the Trogs, they are capable of conducting warfare against them at their weakest point, then you have this relationship where they finally recognize their humanity in a strange way, and agree to let them live on an off planet in peace and harmony, or at least in a tangential. It's unclear at the end of the film if they actually achieve peace and harmony. But it's sort of like the elders of this Trog civilization come to an agreement that, maybe we shouldn't be G-word-eyeing them periodically, that actually we should just leave them alone. And it's a policy of détente rather than integration, which I feel is something that even would be quote-unquote problematic to the quote-unquote values of multicultural global liberalism nowadays. And what's fascinating to note about the Trog society is that they're still largely a traditionalist and collectivist-based society, even though they have achieved feats of technological advancement in human consciousness that goes far and above current human civilization. They still have rites of passage where each Trog child, like Taiwa and her group of friends, are expected to go off and perform their first meditative ritual, to which they can lift off their consciousness or their sort of, what would you say, their soul or their conscious energy into the orb that physically floats above in the aether and into space. So rather, space travel is not facilitated purely by technology, but by their own conscious energy or their psychical exobody apparatus, or one could even say a form of spiritual manifestation into travel, into astral projection and astral travel. And so what you have is you have a big emphasis on a constant obsession, much as there was among the upper and bourgeois classes in Europe and North America at the time. This constant obsession because of, various things through wealth and so forth. The need for higher consciousness and spiritual integration, but one that, in a weird way, keeps to form of a traditionalist society. There is, however, I would say the one point of you wouldn't factor into it depends on which tradition actually, but in certainly the sort of colloquial understanding of traditional prudish, morally driven society, you would say that the one point of contention would be the various liberatory practices of the Trogs. And that's one point I will get to at the end, which is a theme I didn't mention at the beginning of this, which is a theme of eroticism. And eroticism as a spiritual vector, but also as a means of control, ironically enough. This classic libido dominandi type of analysis. But anyways, what's very interesting is that you have this theme of Prometheanism, of giving technology and an awareness of a different revolutionary form of politics to the alms, and a sort of quest to remember their own history, the way that the Trogs are obsessed with their own history and obsessed with their own explorations of meditation and consciousness, that even Trogs blend into each other and share very distinct attributes. You can't tell them apart. Their clothing often changes and conforms into different stages of ritual and meditation and rituals around meditation. And so you have a very distinct form of quote-unquote soft science fiction. And what's very interesting is that the unawareness of the sort of class and interspecies dynamic between them is in some ways a byproduct of their meditative practices. That they're the Eloi that are constantly trapped in the clouds, literally and also figuratively. And that they've sort of neglected worldly duties. And it's very interesting how there are a number of different abandoned spaces within the Trog planet, such as the abandoned park, the abandoned rocket facility, the fact that they've gone beyond the need for physical, what do they call it? Physical propulsion technologies, that they've found a way to do this literally within the body and within consciousness. But the discovery of that from the perspective of the Ohms, going back to form, it really does have a very interesting dynamic that a lot of science fiction plays with, whether it be Planet of the Apes or it be even like something contemporary, which I was a fan of up until the last few seasons, which like Adventure Time, you have this whole mythology or this sort of mythology of like the hidden history of a nuclear apocalypse or some mass extinction event that befalls humanity. And these new strange creatures come out of this evolutionary deficit of human trajectory being disrupted. And perhaps the theory goes that the Trogs are what humans could have become, these giant figures towering over the landscape who are supreme spiritual beings, if it wasn't for this extinction event that befell them. And so you do have this quest for lost time and the promise of Promethean technologies and knowledge itself being a immense resource that is met with hostility and skepticism because of humanity reverting back to a quote, I know it's not a politically correct term, primitive, but more of a hunter-gatherer tribal society that is incredibly superstitious of the dangers of technological development, but then becomes a necessity being faced with a G-word idol Trog presence that they simply cannot tolerate anymore. And of course, human knowledge, much like the revolutionary knowledge of people like Fanon traveling back to the global south to deliver that knowledge to subjugated peoples or to the subalterns of the world, or what he calls the wretched of the earth, as the Ohms basically are the wretched of the earth. But also notice how the term for Ohms, or humans, the basic root word of humanoid, notice how, and again, this comes from Giorgio Agamben in Homo Sacer, the ones who are subjugated, the ones who are untouchables, who are merely human pets for our own entertainment, or for rather the Trog's entertainment, notice how their word is the word of sacred meditation and consciousness and awareness, which is Om. So notice how those who are abandoned to the law, those who are at the lowest rung, that they become sacred, that their untouchableness and their lowliness is a sacred act in a way that reinscribes that dominance hierarchy for the whole of Trog civilization, that they are so lowly that they have become, such as in Roman law, the Homo Sacer, as according to Giorgio Agamben, is someone who is not even, you can destroy them, you can subjugate them, you could use them as pets, you could violate them in various ways, and there is no legal consequence. Because even in Roman and Greek society, there were consequences to the abuse of slaves. Whereas to exterminate them, to treat them as animals, there is no consequence. But yet they are denoted as the Muslim, as the untouchable man, as someone who reverts back to an animalian nature, someone who is so subjugated, who is so oppressed, that they basically are rendered into bare life the way that animals render into bare life. They're merely, they live life through the stomach. They're yeast. They propagate. They are concerned about birth. Their life and death is cheap and easy. They come and go into existence out of their own will, or rather they're outside of will. They merely will for bread or for sustenance, for calories, and they propagate, and then they die a graceless death. And so they're so close to this natural state through their own untouchableness, through their own subjugation, that they become, in a way, a weird form of sacredness. An inverted form of sacredness. That is ultimately the Homo Sacer, according to Giorgio Agamben. And this is why I think it is so brilliant that Leroux named them Oms. That they are a sacred distinction. That they are set apart from the Trog, who have achieved a form of spiritual enlightenment and astral projection through mere will and conscious power, that they are so above that of the humanoids. So I think that's a brilliant distinction. And before I get to the eroticism aspect, this is a line from a Texas Orator article by Carolyn Cabe, and this comes from 2020. And of course, this, I believe, is when the Criterion Collection acquired Fantastic Planet. So you know all like the left-coded video essay, which I mean, I guess I'm doing my bit of Criterion Collection analysis. I know it's become a meme, like a lot of these soillennial video essayists, a lot of these Chapo Trap House type of people, they discuss Criterion. I mean, I shouldn't bash it. I do quite love Criterion Collection, but upon the arrival of Fantastic Planet, quote, they witness the other end of the Drogs' meditative ritual, which consists of giant headless figures becoming possessed by the Drogs' spirits and dancing together. The Oms use their ship's firepower to destroy these giant figures, endangering the Trog's survival. The Trog assemble in a state of panic, agreeing to something must be done about the Oms to ensure survival. Defeated, they ask to make peace with the Oms, vowing to stop their routine G-word-eyed extermination of Oms and give them a separate satellite to live peacefully. We conclude that with a narration from a headset information session that asserts the coexistence is only route to survival. While an argument can be made for the gripping effects of the film's aesthetic and artistic brilliance alone, Fantastic Planet presents a unique analysis of human destruction. And again, I mentioned apartheid, I mentioned the Austrian painters regime, but I did not mention the Soviet Union. It is a product of the time thematically commenting on the Soviet Union's invasion of its neighboring Eastern European countries. Depending on, I mean, if you're like some weirdo tanky, if you're some like Hazoid, you would say that, oh, well, no, that was totally voluntary. The Soviet Union could do no wrong. Come on, but, we all know. Anyways, let's not comment so much on these matters. Anyways, the context surrounding the film's production overlaps with the cultural cataclysms such as apartheid in South Africa, the rise of political turmoils in the 1960s in the U.S., post-colonialism, and the mass G-word-eyed of what the Austrian painter called the inferior races that occurred during World War II. Let's not comment on that too extensively. The Soviet Union's invasion of several served as a basis for the film's anti-anthropocentric themes, but its analogy extends far beyond that, rooting the cause of most civil unrest in anthropocentrism and state-sponsored ethno-narcissism. It's funny how they use that word, state-sponsored ethno-narcissism, because the ethno-narcissism of the current state ideology is much different than that of, say, colonial Europe. So it puts forth the idea that human beings themselves to be centered of the universe. Center of the universe is what causes the cultural dissonance that leads to inequality. When left festering, this inequality becomes a deep-seated hatred for certain demographics of people, which in turn leads to unspeakable acts, like those that mar our history, committed against marginalized demographics. So Drog's decision finally acknowledged the autonomy of the Oms, provide them with their own land and rights as reminiscent of the Back to Africa movement in the 60s and 70s, and freed black individuals. Oh, but even before, though, even like after during Reconstruction, there was a push towards it. And of course, a lot of the former American slaves went to places like Liberia and enslaved the indigenous populations of those areas. There's quite interesting politics and history to the Back to Africa movement. But of course, there was a reverberation of that was rediscovered by the 60s radicals, as this article mentions, in the 60s and 70s Back to Africa movement. There was a lot of Nation of Islam stuff as well. There was the whole adopting more Africanized names. But of course, the history is complicated because a lot of those names derive from places in Africa that weren't exactly a genetic ancestry to a lot of African Americans that were taken from certain places, like in West Africa, for instance. But that's neither here nor there. The film harkens back to these historical occurrences with an ending that implies that the only true way to acknowledge a previously maltreated demographic is by providing them with physical autonomy, such as land that is separate from their former captors, which is something that Malcolm X said. But of course, that totally violates the current ethos of the post-1960s regime in America, the post-civil rights regime. Christopher Caldwell in his book talks about this. Fantastic Planet tells us that if we want to reconcile our differences with our fellow human beings, we must first exercise our ability to do so by reconciling our differences with the other creatures inhabiting our planet within us. And of course, this supports Fanon's thesis that the only way that you can really assure autonomy is through revolutionary violence. Or you really have to strike, in this case, at the spiritual center of the Trogs, which is their orbiting planet and those statues that are so vital to their exoplanetary political endeavors, which is also linked through the erotic, which I will get to. One of the few redeemable qualities of the Drog is their emphasis on the values of meditation and reflection. All young Drogs must participate in meditation ritual in which they travel to a fantastic planet through meditation for the very first time. The Drogs secure their survival by valuing their fluidity and reflective capabilities as opposed to their bodies. So again, their bodies are very much an after effect. They have sort of, like pure Lois, like pure philosopher, or Brahmanic type of figures, they have abandoned totally their need for the body. Their consciousness physically morphs and transforms their body to a level of spiritual and psychical perfection, to where they can even venture off planet through conscious meditation and effort. So again, very different than, say, an Asimovian technological apparatus in other forms of science fiction. Fantastic Planet is a map of how reconstructing a better society, one that does not depend on the destruction of our environment or one another. It may feel like a DMT-induced hallucination at times, but beneath the whimsical and sometimes frightening imagery and storyscape, Fantastic Planet is a manual that teaches us how to create our very own Planet Sauvage. Okay, that's a good article. So, it is a very interesting, a lot of the animation, as psychedelic as it is, especially the soundtrack of acid rock and musique concrete, a lot of the animation does come off as terrifying. And a lot of 60s, 70s, and 80s European animation does come off that way and does have a very unique aesthetic style. Some elements almost do remind you of Mobius, for instance, especially the drawings that Mobius did of the abandoned Dune film that was going to be directed by Jodorowsky, that was then directed by David Lynch. I didn't watch the new Dune ones, by the way. I'm not that familiar with the Dune lore. But you do have a very interesting contrast between a highly enlightened society, which in a way, I mean, if you're coming at it, I guess, from a right-wing perspective rather than a left-wing one, you could say that, yeah, that's pretty based in Lindy or whatever, that a highly advanced, highly meditative, and Brahmanic consciousness-driven society that has achieved a form of spiritual perfection can also be very brutal and, very brutal and eugenical when it comes to lower races, if you will. I know a lot of right-wingers on Twitter would look at this and be like, yeah, Giga Chad, yes, right? But anyways, that's besides the point. And so the last theme, I think, would be a form of spiritual eroticism or a tantric practice that is rife throughout the whole film. So before we get to that, another theme too is, I think, to highlight this contrast, would be that there is a lot of instances of like quite a brutal existence in this planet filled with these alien creatures, with these alien plants, even the time distance between the drogs and the Oms, as Tara says. A drog's week was equivalent to one of a human year. So the drogs not only have achieved spiritual enlightenment, but they've also achieved a form of, I would say, maybe not full immortality. They can die, but they've achieved a level of development to the point where death is considered a unique event, a unique state of exception, such as when they manage to dispatch one of the attacking, one of these two drogs, or they see when they escape the culling in the abandoned park. Again, another sign that the drogs have completely abandoned the nature around them, and they only live in these desolate city, like quasi suburban cities, where they only focus on meditation all day. They've abandoned other forms of technology to pursue it. They live very stoic lives. They live collectively. Of course, the Yagam, the spiritual forefathers that run the Trog society, they also they only gather to do these meetings every day to give these newsreels. But other than that, it's almost quite empty. They live they live together, but in very sparse conditions, and they've sort of even abandoned huge swaths of the planet around them. And there's a lot of these desolate ruins, because once they've achieved a form of development, then they no longer find the need to inhabit large spaces with technological industrial parks, or even with nature parks and so forth. And so when they escape, there's just some of them walking by, and they notice a huge gathering of these still living Oms that they like. Let's purge, like let's do some right now, and they start stepping on them, and that's when the encounter happens. And so death is treated as a unique tragedy to them, which is very indicative of their development as a species. And even when they highlight bits of nature, when there's sort of like a Moses exile into the desert before they find the rocket facility that they live in, they highlight a lot of these living trees and plant life, and a lot of the alien species are quite brutal. For example, there's this one scene where a lizard-like creature is being hatched, a hatchling, who is then promptly eaten by this promptly ate by this three-nosed type of bulbous creature, which is quite scary. And you even find a lot of species, such as this bird-like figure in the cage, taking these butterfly creatures and throwing them to the ground, and not even consuming them, but these bird-like, butterfly-like creatures, and just throwing them to the ground. And so therefore, even the animal life on the planet, they dispatch for fun, if you know what I mean. So then we get to the real mission of the Trog, which is to exit the planet, to go to the Fantastic Planet, which is a planet orbiting the only planet orbiting their satellite. And you see all of these orbs inhabiting these huge statues that then become these naked statues that are then imbued with the spirit of the Trog, where they do this erotic dance with presumably other creatures of other species in their galaxy or in their universe. And so now you have this linking of a tantric and erotic practice that is giving this form of vril or spiritual energy to the Trog, and is definitely vital to their existence. And this is where the Oms discover their weakness. They destroy these statues with lasers to which the conscious energy, the light goes out of the eyes of the Trog, which is in a way a form of spiritual death. And so these other alien species are then in erotic energy exchange, communication, tantra, and they're sort of lifted off from a lot of the brutal practices of nature in their planet, such as the fight between the Oms with the various, they almost look like velociraptors that they strap to them in a form of fighting. And of course, another thing too is that you have this relation between bare life, eroticism, nakedness, but also the lifting off of those concerns by the Trog. And so, for example, Tar becomes a winningest prize fighter, both when he escapes, but also before that. A lot of the Trog children, they make their pets fight, and of course Tar is one of the best fighters. And it's really sort of a brutalization, the way that a lot of colonial men would become prize fighters in various colonies by the French, British, and Portuguese, and so forth. And so it's a direct relation to the cheapening of life to the subjugated peoples. But it is funny how when you have this intense spiritual connection between people, that a form of erotic energy becomes of vital importance to that civilization. And so I imagine that Taiwa is like a young girl. She's becoming a woman. She wears makeup. She's doing the preparatory rituals of meditation. But at the same time, she exerts a level of empathy towards Tar that is sort of unbecoming to her father, certainly, and to the social structure around her. And also there's a scene where Tar is ridiculed by the other Oms for wearing these ridiculous outfits. And even, like, again, reminiscent of how, for example, in Algeria, a lot of the colonial helpers from the native populations would like wear these various French fashions and a lot of these ridiculous outfits. And again, it's a direct parallel. But also the French translation of terre, T-E-R-R, or T-E-R-R-E, is the earth. So then you have, again, significance in the name. That Terre is going back to the earth from his state of gilded cage servitude and subjugation. He then takes off his ridiculous, pompous uniforms that were given to him by his colonial ruler and master, and then goes back to the earthen color of the loincloth. He goes back to the earth to then transcend that planet and the earth. So it's a sort of, again, you have this hero's journey motif of the one who gains knowledge, who transcends his planetary condition, then gives that Promethean gift to his rightful civilization, even though he experiences the same degree of ridicule. The head elder of the colony is mistrustful of him, that he knows the various boxes, because of course they're trick boxes that are then taken and mistaken for taken by the and they're mistaken for resources. But then of course a lot of them have poison or have various traps, and so he warns them, no, that's a trap that's going to, it's going to snatch you, right? But he's like, no, that box is the just colored powder. I'm assuming some makeup powder. And so he then gives the gift of language of the language of the Trogs to the So again, you do have this connection between language, eroticism, spirituality, and strict, almost, strict egenical class consciousness that pervades all social conditions in Fantastic Planet. So overall, it was a great movie, and I really enjoyed this animation style. I really thought that it was a very creative way of getting at a lot of the social issues at the time in ways that would be totally destroyed if they were to make this film nowadays. Let's be honest with each other. Yeah, let's be honest with ourselves, There were some points where it was kind of ham-fisted. And I do think that it did play into a lot of the divide between a highly advanced, pure civilization and wild nature, and it did do a fair job at critiquing things at the time from that sort of egalitarian perspective that leads in a note of isolation rather than integration, which I thought was quite good. And overall, it was a stunning feat in narration and aesthetics, and I highly recommend Fantastic Planet to watch it. But this has been another Giant Reviews, and I believe next I have to get through that Amish love story book, which I'm almost halfway done. But like I said, like, subscribe, share if you want me to review something. My usual fee is $100 for a film, but we can argue if we can haggle if you want something like an article, a book. I don't know about a book if I have time for that. There's a lot of books I want to review. But yeah, so this has been great. I quite enjoyed Fantastic Planet. So, as I always say, God bless, goodbye, too sweet.